November 1944. A field hospital near Nancy, France. Rain beats against the canvas tents. Inside, the air smells of wet wool, antiseptic, and old blood. Dozens of wounded men lie on wooden cots, waiting for a miracle or a transport train. In the corner of the eye-wound ward, a young American sergeant lies perfectly still. White gauze covers his entire face, wrapping tightly around his skull. His war is over, but his darkness is just beginning. He can hear the heavy footsteps approaching through the mud outside, signaling the arrival of a high-ranking officer. This is the moment when an aggressive general must choose between his rigid military exterior and an unexpected act of quiet mercy. Patton is about to give a permanently blinded soldier the one thing that the battlefield had brutally stolen from him. This is the story of the day General George Patton walked into a crowded field hospital ward and used his voice to paint a picture of the French landscape for a young man trapped in permanent darkness. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show the war he fought and the man he hid. Sergeant Thomas Miller was 22 years old. He came from a small farming community outside Wichita, Kansas. Before the draft board called his number, he worked the dawn shift at his family's grain elevator, watching the sun rise over endless miles of golden prairie. He enlisted because his older brother had died at sea, and he felt a quiet, heavy obligation to carry the family name into the fight. He arrived in Europe with the 95th Infantry Division, full of a young man's curiosity about the old world he had only read about in school books. He wanted to see the ancient stone churches, the wide rivers, and the famous valleys of France. Instead, he spent 90 days looking at the mud walls of a wet foxhole. 3 days ago, a German heavy mortar shell detonated on the lip of his trench. The blast tore through his position, spraying jagged steel across his face. He survived the explosion, but the red-hot fragments left nothing behind. His world was reduced to the smell of damp canvas and the total, permanent silence of a dark room. The enemy in this ward was not a man with an iron cross or a sniper rifle. The antagonist was the absolute finality of blindness. It was a cold, unyielding reality that had no rank, no ideology, and no political motive. It was the war's cruelest theft, taking everything a young soldier had ever hoped to look at and leaving him fully alive to process the loss. This faceless adversary held the entire eye-wound ward in a grip of quiet despair, stripping 22-year-old men of their futures before they even had a chance to understand what they had given up. The doctors could patch the flesh, and the nurses could change the sterile dressings, but no medical officer could restore the light that had been extinguished in a split second of battlefield violence. This invisible thief sat beside the cot of Sergeant Miller, mocking his sacrifice and challenging anyone to change the verdict of the steel fragment. This was the silent, arrogant force that waited in the hospital room, secure in the knowledge that no earthly authority could reverse its work. Sergeant Miller lay still, listening to the rain, firmly anchored to his new reality. By November 1944, the Allied drive across Europe had slowed down to a brutal, freezing slog. The rapid race across France that had characterized the summer months was gone, replaced by heavy rain, thick mud, and stubborn German resistance in the fortified cities. Logistics had become a nightmare. Supply lines stretched hundreds of miles back to the beaches of Normandy, and the frontline troops were running short on everything from winter coats to dry socks. In this environment of constant friction, field hospitals were pushed to the absolute breaking point. Mobile army units set up canvas wards in muddy cow pastures, operating under the constant threat of artillery fire and dealing with an overwhelming influx of casualties. The sheer volume of shattered bodies forced medical staff to adopt a hardened mechanical routine just to survive the mental strain. Under these conditions, higher command structures often became entirely detached from the individual suffering on the ground. Division commanders and staff officers focused on maps, fuel tonnages, and casualty percentages, viewing the human cost as a set of numbers on a daily report sheet. Other generals routinely toured the medical facilities, but these visits were typically formal, hurried affairs designed to check box requirements rather than connect with the men. Senior officers would walk through the aisles, offer a generic word of encouragement to a group of cots, and quickly move on to the next briefing. The crushing reality of permanent injuries, like total blindness, was treated as an unavoidable consequence of industrial warfare, something to be managed by the evacuation system rather than addressed personally. The cold routine of the field hospital continued without interruption, day after day, as the ambulance jeeps kept rolling in from the front lines. The heavy boots stepped through the door, bringing the focus back to the quiet bed in the corner. Major Thomas Evans, a 44-year-old medical officer from Chicago, Illinois, walked into the eye-wound ward with a clipboard tucked under his arm. He adjusted his round spectacles and looked down at the charts, his face a mask of clinical detachment worn thin by weeks of endless trauma. He stopped at the foot of the cot where Sergeant Miller lay, checking the charts before speaking in a low, even tone. He told the sergeant that the morning evaluation was complete and the transport list to the rear zone was being finalized. He explained that the evacuation team would arrive by midday to move him to a permanent facility in England. Miller did not turn his bandaged head toward the sound of the doctor's voice. He remained perfectly flat on the mattress, his hands resting loose on his stomach. He spoke to the ceiling, his voice cutting through the soft rustle of the hospital ward. He said he understood about the transport, but he had one small request before they loaded him onto the truck. He asked if someone could take him outside for just 5 minutes so he could see what France looked like. He explained that he had traveled thousands of miles across the ocean from the flat plains of Kansas, and he had spent his entire deployment buried inside a dark hole in the earth without ever witnessing the countryside. The medical officer gripped the wooden edge of the clipboard, his knuckles turning white under the dim light of the tent. He shook his head slowly, his voice dropping into a harsh, tight whisper. He told the sergeant that such a request was entirely impossible under current standing orders. He stated that the weather was shifting, the roads were clogged with heavy armor, and the hospital staff had 60 incoming casualties to process before nightfall. He insisted that the schedule allowed no time for sentimental diversions, and the regulations regarding patient movement were strictly absolute. Miller remained motionless under the gray wool blanket, his breathing steady and slow. He whispered that he did not need a grand tour or an official escort to the town square. He simply wanted to feel the open air and have someone describe the color of the trees and the shape of the hills before he was locked away in a dark room for the rest of his life. He murmured that he had given his eyes to the soil of France, and it seemed a small thing to ask for a single description of the ground he had purchased with his own sight. The doctor stepped back from the cot, his face tightening with a mixture of professional frustration and buried helplessness. He stated that his duty was to mend the physical damage and keep the evacuation pipeline moving without delay, not to act as a tour guide for wounded infantrymen. He declared that the war did not accommodate personal wishes, and the decision was final. He turned on his heel to leave the ward, but he stopped short when he saw the division commander's chief aide standing silently in the canvas doorway. The young captain held a notepad in his hand, his expression completely frozen as he noted the exchange. He turned around without saying a word and walked quickly toward the command tent. The report reached Patton within the hour. Patton arrived within the hour. His open-top jeep splashed through the thick mud and pulled up directly outside the ward. 4 polished silver stars glinted on his helmet, and his ivory-handled revolvers rested in their holsters at his hips. The canvas flap swung open, and the general walked in unannounced. Every doctor, nurse, and standing patient froze as boots clicked to attention, and a sudden, heavy silence fell over the crowded room. Patton studied him. He walked past the rows of occupied cots and stopped beside the young man from Kansas. "Is this the soldier who wanted to see France?" Patton asked. The medical officer nodded quickly, his voice tight. "Yes, General." Patton looked down at the white gauze. "Can you hear me, son?" The sergeant adjusted his head slightly toward the sound. "Yes, sir, I can hear you. You came a long way from home to fight this war, didn't you?" "I did, General. I just wanted to see what it looked like before the dark took over completely. Patton pulled a plain wooden chair to the bedside and sat down. He did not raise his voice. He did not offer a standard military greeting, and he did not order the room to return to work. The general, known across Europe for his fierce shouting, his crude profanity, and his theatrical aggression, began to speak with a quiet, controlled softness. "The countryside here rolls exactly like your Kansas wheat fields," Patton said. "But the color is different. It is a deep, dark green. The vineyards run down the hillsides in perfectly straight rows, as precise and sharp as a veteran sergeant's formation on parade. The small villages are built from old stone walls that carry the warm color of fresh honey, and the church steeples rise up into the sky as the tallest landmarks for miles around. In the early morning, the light breaks through the mist like someone filtered the sunshine through a pane of thick amber glass. The wide rivers run slow and steady through the valleys, and the arched stone bridges are old. They are much older than our own country. You are standing in a beautiful place, son. You have a choice now. You can let the darkness tell you that you missed it, or you can take my words and hold on to them. Decide now." The field hospital remained completely frozen for 7 minutes. Not a single person moved. The medical officer stood perfectly still by the wooden table, his clipboard lowered, his mouth slightly open. Every nurse in the crowded I-wound ward stopped what she was doing, tears tracking silently through the white dust on their faces. Wounded men on neighboring cots turned their heads toward the sound of the general's voice. Listening to the description of a country they had only known through the smell of gunpowder and the roar of artillery, Patton stood up slowly, his heavy boots making no sound on the damp floorboards. He reached down and firmly gripped the young sergeant's hand, his leather glove pressing against the soldier's calloused fingers. "You earned every single inch of this land, son," Patton said. He turned away from the bed, without looking at the other medical staff, and walked directly toward the exit. In the muddy corridor outside the ward, his personal aide stepped into position to hand him his heavy raincoat. The captain looked up and saw that the general's eyes were completely red and wet with tears. Patton said absolutely nothing to his staff. He pulled his helmet down tight over his brow, pushed open the wooden door, and walked out into the freezing French rain. Sergeant Thomas Miller returned to Wichita, Kansas, in the late summer of 1945. He never saw the grain elevators again, but he learned to navigate his family's farm by the sound of the wind rushing through the stalks and the heat of the midday sun on his shoulders. He married his high school sweetheart in 1947, raised 3 children, and ran a small workshop where he carved wooden furniture entirely by touch. He often told his grandchildren that he had traveled to Europe and looked upon the finest landscapes in the world, carrying the memory of that golden light in his mind until his peaceful death in 1992. Major Thomas Evans stayed with the evacuation system until the end of the European conflict. After the German surrender, he returned to his medical practice in Chicago, Illinois. But colleagues noted that the severe clinical detachment that once defined his bedside manner had vanished entirely. He spent the remaining decades of his career working in veteran care facilities, dedicating his life to rehabilitation work until his retirement in 1974. He never spoke publicly about his encounter with the Third Army commander, but he kept a framed, unedited picture of the rolling hills of Nancy on his office wall until he passed away in 1981. General George Patton never included the hospital encounter in his official field diaries or his post-war memoirs. His personal staff found a single handwritten note tucked inside his desk calendar after his fatal accident in December 1945. The paper carried only a brief, quiet observation written in his own hand, noting that a commander must sometimes give his men the world when the battlefield takes away their sight. Some historians have argued that General George Patton's dramatic presentation in the I-wound ward was primarily a calculated performance, designed to maintain his carefully cultivated public reputation for grand leadership and theatrical impact among his subordinate staff. They suggest that his vivid descriptions were simply an extension of his lifelong obsession with military romance, pageantry, and historical narratives. Other historians argue the opposite, pointing out that this quiet interaction reveals the deeply hidden emotional depth of a commander who felt a heavy, personal responsibility for the catastrophic physical sacrifices made by his frontline infantrymen. What is certain is that the written description preserved from that rain-soaked afternoon near Nancy remains an enduring example of unexpected compassion on the battlefields of Western Europe. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same, or would you have walked past the bed to maintain the strict schedule of the evacuation line? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about the war he fought and the man he hid, make sure to subscribe.